Hello, folks, and welcome to another edition of Monday Night Monsters. It is Monday after all. And as you can see, I'm here all by myself for the moment because my co host Christopher was having a bit of problems with his server and he was kind of going in and out, a little bit of the max headroom thing going on from the 80s or 90s. But he will be here momentarily. But I will tell you, I'm excited for this show for a couple of reasons. For the last few episodes, we have been going to our comments, to our viewers, and seeing what kind of shows they would be interested in seeing. The one to go was one of the suggestions. And this week, we are having another show dedicated only to a suggestion made by one of our viewers. And we are going to be doing mummies. And Christopher, welcome to Monday Night Monsters.
Guys. My apologies. My computer was misbehaving a little bit and I needed to reboot. Sorry about that, folks.
That's right. I was explaining to them everything is fine. There's no curse here. There's nothing to see. You haven't taken out any kind of mummies lately or anything like that, right?
I don't know. It could be that scarab that I have in the cup back there. I don't know. It might be dropping a little curse action on me there.
It might be. It might be. Yes. Yes. Because, like I was saying, that this is the show. Because we are so dedicated on what our viewers are asking to see, that this is another one of those shows that we've dedicated to a viewer suggestion.
Well, in this case, believe it or not, I believe it came from Ken, who, of course, Ken DaCosta. If you've he's kind of, to our X-Men here. Apologize again. A little bit of the curse of the mummy, but we'll get through it.
But I you know what? Yeah, it might have been whatever. This was not our ideas. It came out of the ether from somebody else's intelligence, and that is what we're bringing to you today.
Very good. So one of the things we were going to talk about to get started tonight is the fact that, of course, we are very excited to be doing this topic on sort of the tradition of the cursed mummy and the fact that it's become a horror icon over the last century or so. In fact, interestingly enough, 2022 is the 100th anniversary of the discovery of King Tut's tomb. So that's
yes. I want to add one thing here, and
I was not a big
Yep, you're there with us, Christopher. Oh, there you go. You were going in and out a little bit there, my friend. Everything's good. Everything's good. No, we didn't catch the last thing that you had said.
Well, I was just going to say is that this year is the 100th anniversary, and actually month is the 100th anniversary of the discovery of Tut's tomb. And believe it or not, when we chose this show, I didn't even realize the fact that it was discovered in April of 1922. So this is a very, very timely show, certainly. And the story of the mummy, of course, becoming such a huge horror icon over the last century.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to mention, because we like to talk about movies so much here as well, too. It made such an impression on me whenever I was a child. The Boris Karloff mummy, that classic feature, that really is one of the things that got me into the interest in archaeology and anthropology, even before Indiana Jones and his fedora. If you can believe it, little Ron Murphy, back whenever I was in grade school, I actually had a pith helmet because I was so enamored by the mummy movies. That's what I wanted to do. It's great. And then, of course, Indiana Jones enters and it makes it a little bit more sexier. But this really is a turning point for me. And that's why I'm so excited to do this show.
Now, going into this, I had started to say this before, but I know I was breaking up a bit. I really didn't have a huge wealth of knowledge about mummies. And this is what I was starting to say, is that every time we do one of these shows, it's like a brand new experience for us. We're learning as we go along the way. We don't walk into every one of these shows as experts on these topics. And it's one of the reasons why we're excited that you folks chime in. You give us information, that we haven't heard of, or suggestions, bits of folklore. So we love to hear what you have to say, and the suggestions for new ideas. I think one of you fine folks had suggested last week that we do a program on hellhounds, and we're actually going to be sort of exploring the idea of hellhounds, black dogs, and all these great symbolic animals like that from history in an episode in a couple of weeks. And so we do love this. And the mummy topic, I think, is a fascinating one, and I'm really looking forward to getting into it tonight. One thing about mummies, obviously, is that I think if you're anything like me, the first mummies I think I ever saw were probably on Scooby-Doo. There's no getting around it. And I don't think I would be the man I am today if it was not for Scooby-Doo. I mean, here was a monster hunting group of teenagers who were running around, and I think doing a lot of what we do every week, Ron, which is sometimes pulling the mask off of old Farmer Weatherby and revealing that the mummy really was all along just a little bit of a misunderstanding or somebody's hoax. But that's not our entire purpose. Obviously, we're not just here to debunk things. We're here to explore all the different ways in which these stories become iconic.
Absolutely. They would have got away with it if it wasn't for Christopher and Ron.
Absolutely. I'd like to think of myself as a kid, but these are not blondes in my beard. That's all I can tell you. I feel like the mummy really kind of had a resurgence in popular culture just a couple of years ago, especially with the release, a couple of years ago, now going back almost 20 years. Hey, Jeff, welcome in tonight. And I saw Marianne in there as well. With the 1999 film, The Mummy, which was directed by a sort of big action director there, Stephen Sommers. Some of you may know that that's actually a remake of the original Boris Karloff film from 1932, I believe. 1932 was, I think, when it was made. And that movie was tremendously successful, tremendously popular back in the 1930s. And then the Mummy remake a few years back with Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz, I believe is his love interest in there, became hugely successful, probably the most financially successful monster movie of many years at that time. And I think that it really kind of rekindled interest in the Mummy. I've noticed over the last decade or so, more and more mummy movies seem to be getting produced. And so obviously the film, the concept still has a tremendous amount of intrigue in it and still fascinates people.
It definitely has an appeal to it, doesn't it? Because I think that is, again, we had talked before we came on. It's that idea of this Oriental flavor. There's something exotic about it. And I actually enjoyed The Mummy, but I remember whenever it came out, the remake, one of the big critics, the problems they had was the mummy did not have bandages. It was not a wrapped mummy. This was not your typical mummy. So I think probably before we get into it, do all mummies have to be these wrapped kind of creatures that we see Boris Karloff, walking around with?
Well, that's interesting, and actually, I'm gonna tell you that you probably don't remember this because it was such a long time ago. But in The Mummy with Boris Karloff back in 1932, he, in the opening scene when they discover the mummy, is found wrapped in his bandages in his sarcophagus. But by the next scene, his bandages are gone, and he actually spends the rest of the movie looking like just a very withered old man. It wasn't until later sequels that the shambling mummy with the wrappings, dragging around, actually became such an icon. And this is going to be, I think, a fascinating aspect of what we're talking about tonight, because despite the fact that this episode is called Curse of the Mummy, in the old legends that these stories sort of evolved from, people didn't believe that these mummies were getting up and walking around. They simply believed in the curses associated with them. So it really was the Universal films that created that idea of the living, shambling, mummy running around, usually, looking either for his ex-girlfriend or some sacred artifact that he needed to sort of prolong his immortality. So it's a very transformed legend. But the old legends actually, again, are much more about curses and magic and the effects thereof. And I think that that's how a lot of it's going to play out this evening. For one, have always been fascinated by Egypt and Egyptian mythology, and there's just, I don't think there's any more iconic image in the world than that classic image of the pyramids at Giza, which were all, of course, tombs for pharaohs, and each of them believed to contain a mummy. And so I think it's going to be, again, really fun this evening to explore this.
Yeah. Another thing that I want to point out, just a little bit of trivia here. Did you realize that until the Eiffel Tower was built, the Great Pyramid of Cheops was the tallest building in the world?
I did not know that. That's
That is a true
fascinating.
story. True story. And that's the other thing, we're drawn to that as well, too, because it's kind of like this lost civilization as well, with this kind of intelligence and wherewithal that we've kind of lost in the sands of time. And anything associated with that has a bit of the paranormal to it, because we can't really explain what all happened. We really don't know exactly how the pyramids are built. And so maybe some of these curses do have some sort of credence in them as well, too. So we already are pre-programmed to go in there believing that these things can happen to us.
Now, Jeff just pointed out a really important fact is that only the very, very wealthy, the pharaohs, the nobles, were actually wrapped intricately the way that we tend to see mummies in the movies. And it's also worth noting that mummies exist within nature, that mummification is not necessarily the process of wrapping and preparing and embalming the dead, as much as it's the process of a body becoming preserved, usually through drying. And we're going to talk a little bit about how mummies are created intentionally, as the evening goes on. But mummies do exist in nature. We have the Celtic mummies that were the people that sank in the bogs, and the bogs preserved them. And when they were found, they were sort of these dried husks. In Mexican cemeteries, they have these dried out bodies that are stored in these upright crypts and things like that. So mummies actually exist all over the world, and sometimes created just through the forces of nature. The choice to intentionally mummify a person is something that the Egyptians believed in, because they believed that the body had to arrive in the afterlife intact in order to be reborn into a new life. And that was the actual purpose of mummification. The sort of fascination that the Western world had with Egyptian archaeology, I think, began really in the Victorian era, but it didn't really take off probably until, I guess, it was around the 1920s or so, when many of the greatest tombs were discovered. Was the Valley of Kings in Egypt. But the thing about we think of ancient Egypt, we tend to think about a fixed period of time. I think that's something we're all guilty of in some ways, is we tend to think of all these periods in time as being like one single time, like the idea that Moses and Jesus and Samson and Delilah and all these characters from the Bible all knew each other and they all existed at the same time, when that's frequently incredibly untrue. They're frequently separated by thousands of years. And that the reign of the pharaohs actually went from 3000 BCE, before Common Era, all the way up to about 400 AD. So that's nearly 3,500 years, the reign of the great pharaohs in Egypt. So that's an immense period of time. And obviously, if everyone out there was getting pyramids built for them and being turned into these elaborate mummies, we'd have a mummy in every one of our closets at that point.
That's right. So, yeah, by the time Alexander the Great died, and I believe it was about 323 BC, these were already ancient. And I remember the great saying, whenever he came upon and seeing the Great Pyramids for the first time, he said, "Only time fears the pyramids." These kind of things are so, like you had said, by the time Jesus was walking the earth, these were already ancient monuments. They already had this mystery about them. But getting back to Alexander the Great, he of course was Greek, but he was so enamored by Egyptian culture, he actually saw himself as, Egyptian god at the time. And there's a rumor that he was mummified, but he was mummified by using by using honey. So his body would have been mummified in honey.
Well, that's definitely a way to not only keep yourself preserved for over an extended period of time, but to make sure that when you come back later, you're very tasty. So that you're like making yourself into a snack pop.
That's right.
So mummification was common even among the common folk, but again, as Jeff pointed out, they did not get to have these ornate burials. They were often sometimes buried in mass graves or in family graves or things like that. But the process that the pharaohs, especially in the later years of the sort of the great era of the Egyptian pharaohs, they tended to think of themselves as living gods on earth. The pharaohs believed that they were the descendants or the children directly, in a very literal sense, of the gods, and that led to some incredibly ornate burials. The pharaohs were dressed in their finery, they were given amulets, and of course, I'm sure, as we all know, frequently buried with in truly incalculable degrees of wealth. The wealth, the jewels, the gold, and the ivory and ebony, and all the different things that went with them were enough to honestly found a dynasty on just for each one of these pharaohs. We rarely, I think, understand just how much wealth was contained within the great the great dynasties of Egypt. They didn't necessarily see it that way because gold was so plentiful to them that they didn't value it quite the way that we would today. But to them, gold was not a rarity at all.
Right, right, right. That's one of the things that whenever Carter uncovered the tomb, he was able to look in, and he was asked, "Do you see anything?" He said, "I think it was something like fantastic things
He
or
said,
something
he
along
said
those lines."
wonderful things.
Wonderful things.
Yeah,
That's right. That's right. Yes, and that was a minor burial, right? I mean,
it was
King
a very
Tut was
minor burial.
buried.
We're
Yeah.
gonna we're gonna talk quite a bit about how Tut came to be, because of course I think he's one of the most notably cursed mummies in all of history, and maybe the very sort of spark point for all this great mummy mythology. But the truth is that Tut's reign, was only about 10 years. He was from the age of 9. That's why they call him very literally the boy king. From the age of 9 to the age of 18, he reigned, and was never considered to be a significant king. And in a way, perhaps that's fortunate, because while he was forgotten as a pharaoh in his own time, it was because of that he had such a non-elaborate burial by Egyptian standards, and his tomb was virtually unknown, and that's what led to it being not plundered the way so many of the other tombs were. So him being forgotten is actually what ended up preserving his burial, which
His
is
legacy. Yeah.
lucky for us.
That's right. That's right.
The process of mummification, of course, was incredibly complicated. It is interesting is that I'm going to actually jump forward in our slides a minute. I want to show a picture of an Egyptian god here who's very important to the story. There were two primary death gods in Egyptian mythology. Like in a lot of polytheistic faiths, faiths that believe in multiple gods, some of these gods shared duties. And the two great death gods of the Egyptian faith were Anubis, who was very much what in Western culture we consider to be the Grim Reaper. He was the collector of souls that guided a soul into the afterlife. And then the king, the sort of the leader or ruler of the underworld, was the great god Osiris, who is actually pictured with green skin, which is maybe, I suppose, appropriate for a death god. But the thing about Osiris is that he may actually be the origin of the reason that mummification happened, because Osiris was himself a mummy. From the feet up to his waist, he was mummified in all depictions. So you'll never see him like you do in the classic Egyptian pose with the legs spread apart, because his lower half was mummified. And the legend of Osiris says that his brother Set, who's the closest thing the Egyptians had to a devil, that Set murdered Osiris and chopped him into pieces, but that Osiris's wife found him, gathered up the parts of his body, used the wrappings to bind him back together to allow him to be reborn to become the god of the dead. And so in a way, it's either the origin of the reason that the Egyptians would mummify their dead in order to restore them so that they could go on to the afterlife, or possibly just a metaphorical way to explain why mummification was considered so important to them.
Yeah, I like that idea very much. So let's go into explaining the process of mummification.
It's quite an extensive process, and I know you know a good deal about it, so I'm going to let you take it away.
Yeah. So from what I've gathered, I've heard it could be anywhere from 40 to 72 days, where you have to take the body and you have to place it in natron, which is a salt, to actually dry out the body, to remove all the liquids from the body. But before that, there's elaborate ceremonies such as opening of the mouth, because it was believed that the spirit, as close as we can get to the soul in Egyptian culture, the spirit that animated the body was called the Ka, and that Ka would exit through the mouth. And sometimes, even whenever the body was buried, that Ka could go out and almost act like a ghost, a disembodied spirit, and then it would return through the mouth in the morning after the night was over. But this Ka was very important because, as I said, that was the animating spirit. And not only was that part of the body important, but so was the other parts, like the liver and the kidneys, and all these kind of organs would have been kept in canopic jars. Right, there we go. You're on the ball, my friend. So each one of those jars would hold a particular organ. The brain was considered useless. They would use a small tool, go up to the nostril. Sometimes they would take a little hammer and chisel to really get up there and break that bone. They would liquefy the brain and then they kind of pull it out through the nose. So it would have been like a really bad cold going on. So they would get rid of the brain. But the one part that was essential in the mummification process, and that was the heart,
Yes.
because the heart is what you would be judged upon. In the afterlife, it would be take your heart and they would weigh it on a scale to find out if it has done, greater deeds or lesser deeds, sins more or less. And the heart would be placed back into the body, and then the body would be again wrapped up. And in that wrapping, you would have all kinds of herbs and spices going in there, all kinds of great resins put in there, so it would smell
Just
very
like
good.
Kentucky Fried Chicken.
Again, just like with not quite as good as Alexander the Great, but and then they would put symbols in there and prayers in there, and it would be wrapped up. And then, of course, you would have to be buried with all kinds of grave goods. And because you were going on to your world in the afterlife, they would take. Well, we talked about that when we did our show about the golem a few weeks ago. They would take Ushabti figures and put them into the tomb too, and these would be brought back to life in the afterlife to serve as servants for the person that's interred. So as we can see, there is a great deal of mythology around this. There's a whole tradition around how these kind of things go. And they would also mummify animals such as, ibis birds and crocodiles and cats. So there was a lot of things that were going on. It was a part of a very immense religious tradition. And one of my favorite things is just the idea of how long it took to go through the process of mummification.
And I've always been fascinated by the fact that they believed that even in death in the tomb, that they would still, that the ka, for instance, was capable of becoming hungry, and so they
Yeah.
would leave food in the tombs, and they would leave personal items, brushes and combs and things like that for grooming, because they believed that in the afterlife you still might need those things. In fact, one of my absolute favorite moments ever in a film is in The Birdcage, fantastic movie, The Birdcage, when Nathan Lane's character, has sort of a breakdown and decides to leave, and he's going to basically go and sit in a cemetery and let himself die because he's so upset at Robin Williams' character. And Robin goes finds him sitting at a bus stop waiting to get to the bus to this place called Las Copas, which is this big cemetery. And he finds him sitting there and he says, "So if you were going to the cemetery, why did you bring a bag?" And he's like, "Well, I need a toothbrush and things like that." And Robin Williams just so brilliant just says, "How Egyptian." It's a brilliant moment. It's a really brilliant moment, but it's true. They had a vision that the afterlife was much like the mortal life, and that if you got to the sort of final stage of life where you would actually become permanently a resident of the afterlife, it was much like the mortal world, except perfect and pure, gold and the rivers of honey, and you would actually be hobnobbing with the gods. But until that time, it was also believed that if you led a good life, you could be reborn in a new body and have a whole new life ahead of you. If you were not, however, if you were, a bad person, your soul basically would be condemned. And there was certainly an Egyptian equivalent of hell, where you would go stepping down on the sort of reincarnation ladder instead of having a new human life. But I often think when I look back on Egyptian mythology and Egyptian philosophy or theology, how much of modern Western theology was influenced by that, because their concept of the afterlife is very much the way the Western portrayal is of heaven. Their concepts of sin, even the idea of the heart being the center of the soul, which is something that from a biological standpoint, of course, the heart is a very important part of the body, but it's not more important necessarily than the brain. But the idea that we have today, where we constantly refer to people as, having a good heart or his heart is in the right place, we tend to still associate the heart as the most important organ, and nobody says his brain is in the right place. In fact, sometimes I wonder if we value the brain much at all, nowadays. But it is. I really do wonder if the Egyptian theological sort of landscape really influenced how Western culture developed its perspectives on the afterlife and the afterworld.
Yeah, I think whenever we talk about the Judaic tradition, if we are to glean a little bit of history from what was going on in regarding any kind of enslavement of the Semitic people in Egypt, I think that if we take that as a kernel of truth somewhere in there, and I'm not espousing a full blown exodus of any kind, but I'm talking about a time whenever there were peoples from the Judaic culture that was, somehow enslaved within Egypt, even a small group. You could see how, especially with an emperor like Amenhotep the Fourth, Akhenaten, how his idea of a monotheistic type of approach to the universe could have definitely played upon these folks in that environment. And I do think that there is a crossover here, and more so than even in Greco-Roman religions, because with the Egyptian religions, there was an idea that we had to maintain ourselves, that we had to be, I don't like to use the word good people because that's really not what they were looking at, but the idea that we had to have some sort of moral compass. We had to treat others, in order to pass that final judgment. And we have that idea all kind of laid out for us in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the rites to go through in order to become, I guess, graced enough to have that salvation for ourselves.
This is an image here of actually Anubis, who, as I say, sort of served as the Grim Reaper, leading a soul through the afterlife, eventually to have his meeting with various gods. You have Thoth there, the ibis-headed god, Osiris, of course, the sun god Ra, but Osiris there sitting in judgment, and that he would be your last stop, and the one who would ultimately judge your soul, weigh your heart, and find if, in fact, you were lacking or worthy of going on to the afterlife. And Anubis also, by the way, I just wanted to throw up another panel here. Anubis also was the god of mummification, which is fascinating. And frequently, some of the most common images of Anubis in Egyptian tombs actually show him mummifying the dead, which I think in a way is supposed to metaphorically symbolize that he is the one who prepares you for the afterlife, the one who sort of coaches you in what you're going to need to do and what you're going to experience.
Yeah, that's a good point. If you go to the last slide, I think that's it's kind of interesting whenever you talk about him being the Grim Reaper. You can see he's taking the deceased by the hand. So you're not going it alone. You're being led there by somebody that has your back. And then the heart is there on the scale. And if it judged that if it was too heavy, then that crocodile creature there would have eaten it, and then you would go to the whole eternal damnation in their underworld. But apparently he was judged worthy, and now he's being presented to Osiris. So I think it's a very beautiful way to look at things. And as you have said before, it does certainly entertain our beliefs of how everything works. If you especially look at Dante's Inferno, how the character had to be led through the underworld. Without these kind of things happening in Egypt, we would not have that to draw upon in our Western culture.
I think that's very true. I also think it's interesting that in a way there's another parallel here, which is, as I mentioned earlier, Set, who is a snake-headed god, is the sort of the closest that the Egyptians had to a devil. He was an almost entirely evil god, and that Anubis was more like your defense lawyer, and that there is actually a really specific parallel to that in Christian theology, which is and in one that's equally misunderstood, because I think that Anubis gets a bad rap. I think Anubis, because he is a death god, is frequently portrayed, when you see popular portrayals, whether it's in films or in fiction, as an evil being, which of course even in Egyptian mythology who's not at all. But in Christian mythology, there are the characters of Lucifer, and there's the character of Satan, and these are not the same being. And it's interesting to me that in Christian culture we actually have this same idea. Lucifer is the fallen angel and the one who, for all intents and purposes, is the devil, where Satan is not. Satan, I believe, comes from Shaitan, and it basically means prosecuting attorney. The difference being between Anubis and Shaitan is that Shaitan was the one who spoke of your sins before, when he brought you before God. He was the one who spoke and told about what you'd done badly in life, and Jesus was the one who read from the book of life and said how good you'd been, and then God, of course, would weigh that balance and determine whether you were wanting or not. But he wasn't a bad individual. Shaitan was just the one whose job was to speak of your sins. And so he, I think, once again, like Anubis, gets a little bit of a bad rap, and we tend to assume that Satan and Lucifer are the same being. But from a biblical biblical perspective, not at all.
And I think that if any of our listeners is having a hard time believing that, all you have to do is turn to the book of Job, and you see in the celestial courts of God himself, Satan is allowed to run around up there, when he presents his case to God quite handily. So, but these are things that we in the 21st century in Western culture really are, we don't like to talk about death, but death is a very real part of the world. And until relatively recently, there was that horrible fear of it. And I think that in the Egyptian culture, you get at least an acceptance of it, that
Yeah.
it is a part of life. And it's a part of life because what happens at your death, it opens you up to something bigger and greater.
I think probably in earlier chapters of human history, we were more accepting of death than we are now because we didn't have the ability to cheat death as much as we do
Sure.
now. I think now, I think we've sort of adopted this idea that death is the great enemy, and that the more you can preserve a person's life, the longer you can extend them. If you can, do anything to stave off death, that's always a positive thing. This is a certainly, I'm sure, a controversial topic, and I don't mean to offend anybody, but of course, that's actually a totally dreadful perspective, because death is part of the wheel of existence. It's the wheel of life. And if people don't die, we don't have the room, we don't have the resources to bring in new life to the world. So if people don't die, that wheel is broken, and the sort of cycle of life ends up being stymied. And so the idea that in a lot of cultures, pre-Christian cultures, death was a very normal, very natural part of the cycle, and that there were these death gods who were not villains, they were just a part of the process. I think that's a much more natural perspective. Again, I don't mean to offend anybody. Certainly nobody's out there anxious to die, or find discover the afterworld firsthand. But I think we as a species need to make more peace with the idea that death is a natural process, and not vilify it quite so much.
And as I've been listening to you talking there, Christopher, you've hit the proverbial nail on the head yet again, because what does the mummy do now for us? Why is it such a popular figure in our culture or in our movies? It's because it is that introduction of death right in your face, even if you don't want to look at it, right? This is your mortality. Somebody wrote about on here, it says, let's see, Mary Beth said, I never really thought of mummies as monsters. And in reality, they are not monsters. They are a deceased human being. And whenever they are coming upon us, they become monsters only as far as they introduce us to the morality right in our face, right? And that's what happens. So yeah, these aren't things that go bump in the night. These are things that come out of another world, the underworld, the eternal darkness, whatever you want to call it, and they confront us with our own mortality. So that is kind of like we talk about the idea of the Jungian mirror. This is the mirror in which we're looking at. These are simply our reflections of our fears of our own death.
In fact, interestingly enough, and very much in keeping with all of that, is that the mummy horror stories that have been such a big part of our culture for the last century, almost all have the same basic premise, which is that the mummy the person who is mummified in life breaks that sacred cycle in some way. They either try to cheat death, they try to gain immortality on earth, or they try to do something that breaks that sacred bond. They always are a betrayer of some kind, and they are cursed then to become one of the living dead, which is basically being kept away from the afterlife and kept away from their eternal reward. And so nearly every mummy story involves this sort of profane immortality concept, which again is the idea of breaking the cycle of death. And so even in that, the mummies of the horror films are monsters because they're the monsters who want to break the natural order versus just go to their afterlife in a peaceful manner and go and join the gods, or at least go and allow the gods to judge them and decide for themselves whether they should be reincarnated on earth.
But our cinematic mummies and even our literary mummies, most often they are cursed while they're still alive, so they cannot have an eternal reward or that eternal punishment.
Yeah, they're almost always portrayed as people who were evil in life, and again, yes, so subject to a curse of some kind. I think it's interesting, and this is a good place to sort of juxtapose or segue into how the mummy became such a popular modern such a popular modern monster and how it sort of joined popular culture. And I think I don't know every piece of mummy literature that was written before the dawn of the 20th century, but probably the most well known, even though it's a very, very small work, is Bram Stoker's novel Jewel of the Seven Stars, and or the Jewel of Seven Stars rather. And this is probably the first horror novel actually written about the mummy, and it actually contains a lot of the tropes that we're very accustomed to in the classic mummy literature. It has an Egyptologist who becomes obsessed with resurrecting this ancient Egyptian queen called Terra, and he's on a dig in Egypt. He discovers the tomb of Terra, and he brings her back to England and starts to go about the process of the rites, reading from the Book of the Dead that would reanimate her. And it turns out that his daughter Margaret in the story is either the reincarnation, the modern reincarnation of Terra, or in some way connected to her, and that somehow she will be pivotal to the resurrection. And it's not a phenomenal book. I'm not going to say it is. Bram Stoker, of course, was the author of Dracula. He was a good writer, but he wasn't always a great writer, and some of his books were really pot boilers. There's probably a reason that this one is a new discovery for a lot of people. Not a fabulous book, but I think that it really kind of established the mummy trope the way we know it today. And it has been made into a variety of different films over the years. It was made into a film by Hammer that was called, I think, Blood from the Mummy's Tomb. Hammer Studios, fantastic 1960s, 1970s British film studio. This one, which was a 1970 film with Charlton Heston, of all people, called The Awakening. So it's been adapted a few different times, but it really is, I think, one of the pieces of literature that set the stage for the modern monstrous mummy trope. Sorry, that was way too much alliteration. But
no, that's a good way to explain it too, as well. I've always had a problem with Stoker because his Dracula was so well done. You know, it was really one of those things. But the other ones, he seems like he was really not in his wheelhouse, so to speak. You know,
correct. Yeah,
but as you said though, without these kind of missteps, we would not have the foundation laid upon which other things were built upon. So we needed those things.
And Stoker, in the wake of Dracula, which was by far in his entire lifetime his most successful piece of work, but even still in his lifetime, Dracula didn't earn him significant financial success. But he did want to recapture that lightning one more time, and he tried a few different times with stories like The Lair of the White Worm, which unfortunately wasn't a tremendous success. And I think it was one of his later novels. I think it was 1903, 1904. It was published, Jewel of the Seven Stars, or The Jewel of Seven Stars. I always say it the other way around, but. So success really kind of eluded him. That's not going to be the story he was remembered for. I think we've got Dracula kind of firmly in that place. But I will say that even though that story really did set the stage in a lot of ways, it wasn't Stoker's book that really made the mummy explode onto sort of the landscape of modern culture back in the early 20th century. It was the discovery of Tut's tomb. Tut's tomb was discovered in 1922, and I like to point out, just because I have a little pride of place, that it probably would never have been discovered. It wasn't somebody from my hometown, actually. Gentleman by the name of Theodore M. Davis. Theodore M. Davis, from about 1902 or so into, I think, around 1913, was a sort of a marshal of antiquities working in Egypt, and he was overseeing and funding and providing funding for a variety of different expeditions. And under his watch, I believe at least 30 tombs of pharaohs and important nobles were actually discovered in Egypt. But the one tomb that eluded him over the course of his time there was unfortunately Tut's tomb. And what's fascinating about that is that he was so very close, and it's almost a tragedy considering how desperately he did want to find Tut's tomb, because he found a burial cache of the embalming tools that were used to embalm Tut. And I guess it was a tradition in Egypt to actually take the embalming tools, because they had touched the body and interacted with the body. It was believed that a part of the ka, part of the soul, actually imbued themselves into these embalming tools. And so the embalming cache was either buried with the body or usually immediately adjacent to the tomb. he discovered in his time, he discovered the embalming cache, but never found the entrance to the tomb. And when he held his last dig in Egypt, he was only 2 meters, literally about
Wow.
6 feet from the entrance to the tomb, and unfortunately never ended up finding it. So it's a little bit of a tragedy, but he laid the groundwork that resulted in the 1922 discovery of the tomb by a fellow named Howard Carter, who you had mentioned earlier. Howard Carter was another Egyptologist. He was funded by a fellow by the name of Lord George Herbert, who was the Earl of Carnarvon. He had quite an extensive title. And he's the one who provided the funding, but Carter was the one who did most of the digs. And when Tut's tomb was finally discovered in 1922, it was a worldwide phenomenon. It was absolute madness. We were discussing earlier the fact that it influenced pop culture in a way that only rock stars do today, with people wearing Egyptian jewelry, and Egyptian headdresses became very popular on stage and things like that. So it really kind of changed the cultural conversation for quite a long time.
Yes. Without that discovery, we would not have Walk Like an Egyptian by the Bangles.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or King Tut by Steve Martin. So
Steve Martin,
we're dating
right.
ourselves. We're desperately dating ourselves. We're old men and we're proud of it. All right.
But the one point of trivia that we have to make before we move on: where did Lord Carnarvon live?
Yeah, I have to bring this up. Of course, now there's got to be a few people who recognize this house. Lord Carnarvon's Highclere Castle was, of course, the house used in Downton Abbey for, 6 seasons. And to this day, if you do happen to be in England, yes, it was a real house. It wasn't a set, and still there up in northern England in Cumberland to this day. But he had a tremendous collection of Egyptian artifacts in that house. And to this day, you can actually visit Highclere Castle and actually see real Egyptian artifacts, as well as a replica of Tut's tomb, not the original Tut sarcophagus, but a replica of it, so you can get a little bit of a sense of what it was like to live there in Carnarvon's time. But I wanted to jump up a little bit past that. I also wanted to point out a few things about the way that the cultural phenomena of King Tut affected the world at that time. And of course, we had talked about the fact that the 1932 movie The Mummy, starring Boris Karloff, and of course, he did look like a normal human being during most of the movie, but there were a scene or two of him shambling around in those rags. And this was very much directly inspired by the discovery of Tut's tomb. And in fact, even the story of Imhotep, the name of the priest who becomes mummified after defying the will of the pharaoh, was very much inspired by the real story of King Tut. King Tut married a beautiful woman who happened to be his half sister by the name of Ankh-Sunamun. And you may remember that in the original and in the remake of the Mummy film, that this is Imhotep, and the woman that he is trying to resurrect, his lost princess, is Ankh-Sunamun. Basically, only a slightly different spelling and pronunciation of the very same name of the princess. So they even actually based these movies on the real characters of Tut, or maybe even more specifically on Tut's vizier, Tut's advisor, who would later, after Tut's death, end up becoming the pharaoh. May have had unhealthy designs on Tut's queen, but it's based very heavily on that real story.
Right, and we really don't know how King Tut died, do we? I mean, he may have succumbed to foul play, and his advisor may have been the one to cause his untimely death.
Absolutely. They say that he had some badly broken bones that they believe were the result of being struck by a chariot, but the actual events of that accident, the vizier had designs on the throne, as far as we know, for a very long time, and certainly ended up again rising to become the pharaoh. And so Tut was not considered a particularly effectual king. He was lame. He walked with a limp and a cane. He was considered fairly sickly in his life. That doesn't mean that he didn't have a sharp mind. It doesn't mean that he wasn't necessarily a wise king or a wise pharaoh, but considered to be weak, and as a result of that, unfortunately easily manipulated and very probably subject to foul play. So a little bit of an old 2,000-year-old murder mystery in there. That's for right. You.
Yeah, they should open that cold case up again.
They should. I mean, modern DNA evidence, maybe we can finally nail the guy.
Absolutely. So we've talked about the idea of. Oh no, we haven't talked about the curse yet. We got to get to the curse.
We do need to get to the
Yeah.
curse, actually. I want to quickly, a couple of things that Tutankhamun reigned beginning in 1333 BCE, before the Common Era, and only, as I say, I think we mentioned this earlier, only reigned for about 9 years. So he was only 18 years old when he died. He became the king at 9 years old, if you can imagine having that kind of responsibility. But that did not have a very long reign. But when Tut's tomb was finally discovered in 1922, it did set off sort of a firestorm of public interest, but it set off something else too. When they first discovered Tut's tomb, the men, the Egyptian workers, were terrified and told Carter not to enter the tomb. Now, he didn't supposedly enter it right away, because he had to summon his mentor there, Lord Carnival, and have him come, because he was the one who was financing the whole thing. So part of the deal was that the Lord had to be there when they opened the tomb. And in between them discovering the door to the tomb and Lord Carnarvon getting there to enter it, Carter had a pet canary. And I know this is a very bizarre juxtaposition, but he had purchased a pet canary, which he loved. And he thought it was a symbol of sort of hope and a symbol of good luck. And so he was very excited. He actually heard to have said that this canary, this bright canary, will lead us to the golden tomb. And the day after they discovered the entrance to the tomb, one of his servants walked into the salon and found a cobra in the cage devouring the canary. Basically, there was nothing left but a handful of feathers. And the servants, who were all Egyptian, were absolutely terrified by this. And they said, this is a proof that there's a bad omen. There's a curse on there. Because, of course, the cobra, as you can see here on this headdress, was the symbol of the pharaoh. And the idea that they discovered a pharaoh's tomb and the next day a cobra would come and devour this symbol that was supposed to represent the successful expedition was way too coincidental for these servants. So they pleaded with Carter not to open the tomb. It goes without saying that Carter thought that was ridiculous and went forward with it. But things didn't necessarily go well in the ensuing months.
Yeah, but wait, there's more.
There is indeed. There's a whole heck of a lot more here. So Carter did in fact enter the tomb, and when they entered the tomb, because as we had discussed, the tomb had been so well hidden and so poorly remembered, it was virtually untouched. They discovered that someone had at one point, probably thousands of years ago, gone into the tomb and had ransacked it, but must have been caught because nothing was stolen, everything was upset, but nothing was actually stolen, or at least nothing significant. And there were still untold riches in the tomb. And so they certainly felt like they had made this remarkable discovery. But it didn't take very long after this for things to start to go badly. In fact, less than 6 months after the tomb was opened, the Earl of Carnarvon died of blood poisoning, some kind of mysterious blood poisoning that he had acquired while in Cairo. Now, this is what's interesting about it. According to his family servants, at the very same time that Carnarvon died, his fox terrier, who was back at home at Highclere Castle, was young and in good health, sat up in his little basket in wherever the dog was sleeping, howled piteously, and dropped dead right there on the spot. Also at that same moment, and I don't know how much of this is folklore, but it's folklore that has lasted for a very long time. In Cairo, all the power went out. And for a good 20 minutes, Cairo was in complete blackness. No one ever understood why that happened. Of course, they had electric light by that time. And about 20 minutes later, it just mysteriously came back on. Nobody repaired anything. It just came back on. And so people really began to whisper that the curse of the pharaoh was already taking effect, and that the cost of opening Tut's tomb was going to be far more dear than the riches they had found there.
The lights were off for every minute that Tut spent a year on Earth.
Huh. Oh, that's intriguing.
Yep.
Wow. I know that's a great little piece of folklore. Hey, I told you we learn things every day, so I didn't know about that one. That's great. Now, only a few weeks after Carnarvon passed away from this blood poisoning, Carter himself became ill. Now, they say that it was partially stress and overwork. Of course, his mentor and the founder of his expedition had died. I want to point out, by the way, I should have said this earlier, but that Carter had been looking for that tomb for 5 solid years, and that Carnarvon, who, as I say, was funding this entire thing, had told him, had already sent him a telegram and said, "That's it. It's too much. I've been spending all this money, and it is, we're done." So Carter said, "Listen, I don't have much more ground to cover in this area that they had staked out." He said, "It's a very short amount of time. Give me one more season just to complete what I'm doing." And Carnarvon reluctantly agreed, and that was when they found the tomb. So it really seemed for a good long time like things were going very, very well, and like they had that marvelous, marvelous moment of discovery when they actually found the entrance to the tomb. But after that, as I say, it really was downhill. So Carter became ill. He did recover, but he recovered physically, but not necessarily financially, because he made a terrible decision. When he did discover the tomb, he decided to grant an exclusive, sign an exclusive contract for covering the exploration of the tomb to the London Times. And that ended up being a terrible, terrible financial decision that did not benefit him at all. And so he lost out on tremendous, tremendous wealth from just the stories that he could have generated. And that he never quite recovered from that. So he did not become wealthy as a result of the excavation of the tomb, although theoretically he should have, because he really was a rock star for a bit.
He was, absolutely, absolutely.
But the spectacular nature of the discovery didn't last as long as the fear of the curse. All of a sudden, newspapers all over the world, they may not have had exclusive access to the dig, but they certainly could report on the curse. And so here we have a few different newspaper titles. The New York Times, of course, reporting on Carter's illness. Fear of curse of pharaohs drives aged peer to death. Curse of the pharaohs is wreaked on Westbury. Tomb digging to go on despite the curse of Egypt. Newspapers were in love with this story. This was the story of the decade. The curse of the pharaohs made real, and people had started to drop like flies. This was crazy. We had people like George J. Gould. He was a railroad tycoon, not in any poor health, who actually was taken on a private tour of the dig site by Carter himself, and the next day developed a fever and succumbed to it within days and ended up dead. Hugh Evelyn White was a man who was actually directly associated with the expedition. He wasn't a part of it, but he was a very close friend, and ended up hosting some of the exhibits, ended up committing suicide. And according to folklore, now again, this is one that I haven't been able to verify yet, but according to folklore, he committed suicide and scrawled in blood on the wall of his room, "I have succumbed to the curse." So he was so terrified of it and the ramifications of it that he took his own life, I suppose, rather than becoming a victim of the curse directly, but of course, as a result, an indirect victim of the curse. We had people like Aaron Ember. Aaron Ember was I believe that he was another associate. He was actually one of the ones that was in the tomb at the time of discovery, who succumbed to a fever. Richard Bethel was the secretary to Lord Carnarvon, and he was killed under mysterious circumstances. He actually had in his possession many of the artifacts from the tomb when he was discovered smothered to death in his own apartment. So these things just continued to happen. Member after member, or even peripheral people connected to the exhumation or the exploration, found themselves dying. In fact, there were even people who had nothing directly to do with it. Sir Archibald D. Reed, he was a medical radiologist, or a military radiologist, and he took X-rays of the body of King Tut, and he ended up succumbing to a fever which killed him within 48 hours after that. So extraordinary stories. Now, this last one is actually quite unusual, because this is from 1995, a young woman by the name of Cheryl Munson. Now, her story is pretty tragic. Cheryl had actually suffered from Hodgkin's lymphoma, and so had a fairly weakened immune system. But she and her husband, she was in recovery. She had endured chemotherapy and was actually doing quite well. She and her husband in 1995 went on vacation in Egypt, and one of the places that they toured was Tut's tomb. But after coming back, she developed a terrible cough cough, and the cough literally over the course of just a few months became unbearable until she was admitted to the hospital. And only a few weeks later, she passed away. It turned out that she had developed a terrible lung infection. And that lung infection was Aspergillus niger, or Niger. This was an Egyptian original fungus that covers the walls of Tut's tomb. And so ordinarily it's not considered dangerous because it's not dangerous, I guess, to people who are in fairly ordinary health, but her compromised immune system couldn't handle it. And so simply walking into Tut's tomb and allegedly touching one of the walls ended up resulting in her death. So again, it feels as if perhaps the curse of Tut's tomb has not finally done with us.
Wow, that's I had no idea about Miss Munson. That's the first time I've ever heard about that one. But I was actually going to ask you whenever we came back to the wrap-up part of the program, is how much do you think this could have been some sort of a biological effect? Not necessarily a biological warfare, but could the curse of a deed have come from something that was buried in there in almost a hermetically sealed chamber to be unleashed upon those whenever they step foot inside of there?
Well, it's interesting to note that, of course, in addition to the fact that things like a fungus can create respiratory infections, is that they can also be, and by the way, this is pure speculation, but it is just me kind of thinking off the top of my head, but they can also have things like hallucinogenic or psychotropic effects on people. And you wonder if a little bit of madness didn't necessarily follow on the people who had entered this tomb. Some people might be more susceptible to another. So the suicides that were associated with it, the things like that, compromised immune system. So it is possible that maybe this fungus within the tomb actually does have at least some effect on it. Obviously, that's not going to cause a fox terrier 3,000 miles away to spontaneously die or knock out the power in Cairo. So maybe there's something preternatural happening here, but certainly there's at least some reason to speculate that there is some biological reason that at least some of these people may have developed depression, madness, or even led to their own deaths in the wake of it.
Now, do you think it's possible the ancient Egyptians knew about this?
I wonder if they did. I mean, certainly, I would say that their knowledge of things like fungus probably wouldn't have been particularly vast. They didn't have, as much as we know, the ancient Egyptians were a fairly advanced race. They didn't have microscopes or microcellular analysis of any kind. So maybe there was some knowledge of it, but I imagine that since they didn't routinely open these tombs, that this sort of, I mean, you have to call it a corpse fungus. What else would it be? It's obviously feeding off of the biological matter in these tombs. This corpse fungus was something they probably didn't have a great deal of exposure to unless they were tomb robbers. And there were plenty of those back then. I think, Jeff had pointed out earlier that many of these tombs, many of them were plundered long before. I mean, when Carter opened Tut's tomb, you had a span of probably close to 3,000 years since that tomb had been opened. But back then, somebody had managed to get in there and had managed to ransack. And actually, one of the reasons that we know that they were likely caught isn't just the fact that almost nothing was stolen from the tomb, but that when Carter found the tomb, the seal was still intact, which means that the rightful authorities would have been able to reseal the tomb properly rather than just a hasty seal up job by people who did a smash and grab. So again, it's honestly hard to say.
Yes. I do not sing nor do I play an instrument, but if I would ever start a punk band, I would call it Corpse Fungus.
I like that. Yeah, no, you know what? If I ever learn to play an instrument, I'm right there with you.
Then we'll do that.
I can play the triangle.
It's been an unbelievably quick evening, my friend.
It has indeed. I just want to say to everybody, by the way, out there, once again, I always like to remind you folks, please, if you're enjoying these podcasts or live streams, please subscribe to Dead Air Full Spectrum here on YouTube. And of course, if you'd ever be interested in picking up Ron's or my books, you can find my books at www.ghostboypress.com. Always happy to see you. I'll be doing a Dracula book coming a little bit later in the year. I've got my books on the Headless Horseman and Ghost Legends of New England. And if you're interested in finding Ron's books, of course, all Ron's books are available on Amazon.com. So you can look him up there. We love having you guys in here with us every week. We love your suggestions, and we haven't chosen a topic yet for next week, but throw those in the comments down below on the YouTube channel, or drop a few in the comment section here, and we would love to hear your thoughts on what to do next time. So guys, as always, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and keep things spooky.
We'll see you next Monday.
See you then.